So in our last lecture, we were talking about how giving reasons serves this incredibly useful social function in realms like ethics and epistemology, other areas where we don't directly sense properties in the world. So we don't smell goodness or touch goodness or taste goodness, ethical goodness at any rate. And we don't have devices to measure them. There's no good person detector. You can point at someone and determine that they're a good person. So instead, to facilitate agreement, to mediate disagreement, and in general try and get at the real nature of beliefs, actions, and principles, we try to create arguments that offer reasons why a person is good or reasons why an action is morally blameworthy and so on. And so giving reasons provides us with this vehicle for getting at the ethical nature of actions and beliefs and principles. And it also provides us with this means of evaluating those reasons as to whether or not they are convincing or unconvincing, determinative or indeterminate with regard to the property that we're interested in. In addition to giving reasons and that social side of reasons, we also have having reasons. And this is incredibly important at an individual level. It's important for social responsibility that we act in ways that are reasonable and that we have reasons for the things that we do. But it's also important for us as individuals to develop a habit of seeking principled reasons for our ethical beliefs, our actions, our choices. We want to make sure that we always try to understand why we're doing something in terms of understanding the principles and the evidence that we would use to justify that to ourselves or to others. And by engaging in that activity, what we find is that people tend to develop more systematic, principled, and fair worldviews. They make better, more consistent choices that take other people and other creatures' interests into account when they engage in this process on a regular basis. So the goal, and this is a goal I think that Rachel's also shares, for giving reasons and for having reasons of an individual level, is to get ourselves to detect when we're acting in ways that are inconsistent with our principles, or when we act one way towards one person and another way towards another person, even though there is no real difference between them with regard to that action. If we believe something about one group of people and those people have no real ethical differences from another group of people, we should have a belief that's consistent and so on. And by giving reasons and having reasons, by evaluating reasons, we come to have a more consistent, systematic, principled approach to how we believe, how we act, and how we justify. Arguments provide us with this vehicle, this structure for giving reasons and having reasons and evaluating reasons. And a crucial part of arguments are inferential claims. So we want to take a minute to go back and think about inferential claim. So we said that arguments are just collections of statements, and they're structured. There are statements that express the evidence, the premises, the shared assumptions that we're basing our model of an inference on, and there's the statement that expresses the conclusion, the thing that is supposed to be made more likely to be true or guaranteed to be true by the truth of the premises. And those two classes of statements are related to each other by that inferential claim, that explicit or implicit claim that if the premises are true, not that they are true, but if they're true, then their bearing on the conclusion is either, in the case of deduction, one where if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, or in an induction, if the premises are true, that makes the conclusion very likely to be true. So this inferential claim is this relationship between the truth of our premises and the truth or likely truth of the conclusion. And a successful argument must have a successful inferential claim. That relationship must really hold. And so last time we talked about the evaluative terms that are associated with inferential claims and with the truth of premises. So we said for deduction, arguments are valid insofar as they have an underlying logical structure such that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. If that relationship doesn't hold, if it's possible for the premises to be true without guaranteeing the conclusion is true, then the argument is said to be invalid. And notice this relationship holds regardless of whether or not the premises are actually true. It's a relationship between the truth of the premises, if they're true, the contingent possibility of their truth, and the truth of the conclusion. So an argument can be valid even though all its premises are false. It'll be valid because if its premises are true, its conclusion has to be true. And for this reason, underlying logical structure, inferential claims, are cognitively and intellectually opaque to us. We have a hard time seeing and evaluating them in our everyday reasoning practices. We tend to be driven primarily by the context in which we give reasons and evaluate reasons, and the content, the reasons and the things that we're thinking about when we're making inferences or offering up arguments. And the underlying logical structure is difficult for us to get a hold of, but it's there and important all the same. In the case of induction, right, that inferential claim says if the premises are true, then they render the conclusion highly probable, more likely to be true than it was before we had the premises, before we had the argument, or based on chance alone. So let's look at inferential claims and see how inferential claims work to make arguments good even when the content isn't good. So every argument is going to have two components to it. It's going to have its content, its premises and whether or not they're true, and it's going to have its logical form, its inferential claim, the underlying structural relationships between the content and the premises and the content and the conclusion. And an argument can have the same logical form but have different content. So two arguments can have the same logical form. They can make the same inferential claim on the basis of the same structural relationships between content without having the same content. And to illustrate this, I'll give you an example of two arguments that I used to give when I taught up in Canada. And when I taught in Canada, the first year I taught there was the year the United States beat the Canadians in the finals of the World Cup in hockey. And so the Canadians were wildly distraught about this. And so because I got a sort of perverse sense of humor, I used to structure all my examples around hockey. So I used to give them this argument. I used to say, look, France has a larger landmass than Canada. The country with a larger landmass has a better hockey team. Hence, France has a better hockey team than Canada. Now, the Canadians were upset. They're very polite about it, but they were upset by this kind of argument. They found it to be bad on every level. But it actually is good. And I would encourage them to look past the content, the things that they believe about the world, and look at the underlying structural relationships that this argument has. So, if the premises were true, if it was in fact true, contrary to fact, that France had a larger landmass than Canada. And if, contrary to fact, land mass was proportional to the quality of your hockey team, so that the country with the larger landmass had a better hockey team, then it really would be true that France had a better hockey team than Canada. Now, it takes a little bit, especially if you're Canadian, especially if you've just been beaten the World Cup by the Americans. But if you work at it, you can see that the structural relationships in this argument guarantee that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. It's just that the premises aren't true, and the conclusion isn't either. So the argument has bad content, but good logical form. And we can see how logical form works with content to create a good, successful deductive argument by changing the content, but preserving that underlying structural relationship. So here's a different argument. It's got the same logical form, the same underlying structural relationships, but the content is different. The things that are being related in a different way, even though the relationships are the same. Canada has a larger landmass than France. The country with the larger landmass has more square miles. Hence, Canada has more square miles than France. Now here, we can see, because the content facilitates this, that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And so we can see that this has a good logical form. But the logical form in the second argument is the same as the logical form in the first argument. The content is different. The structural relationships are the same. And so that's how inferential claims, logical forms, work in arguments. And in the next segment, I'll talk about how we can take advantage of these two components, content and logical form, to evaluate arguments, to determine whether or not an argument gives us a good reason to believe something or whether it fails to give us a good reason to believe something.